The salt air tasted different this far from shore, sharper, denser, as though the ocean had begun reclaiming its own, drawing all sound and warmth into itself and replacing it with the kind of silence only great depth can produce. The research vessel Aletheia floated in open water, some 400 kilometers off the Kerguelen Plateau. Beneath it lay a trench that had only recently been added to the bathymetric surveys, a deviation in the abyssal plain, possibly tectonic, possibly something else. It had no name yet. The satellite imaging from last winter had revealed the anomaly, but the deeper character of the depression, the nature of what might inhabit it, remained entirely unknown. Dr. Mara Renaud stood at the starboard railing, her eyes fixed on the dark line where sea met sky. She had spent much of her life in the company of water, though not always by choice. Born in Marseille, she had grown up listening to her mother's stories of the Calanque's rugged limestone coves scattered along the Mediterranean coast, and to her father's cautious warnings about currents and undertows and storms that rose without warning. Both had worked the sea in different ways. Her mother a marine ecologist, her father a coastal engineer. The house had always smelled faintly of brine and charts. Dinner conversation drifted from fish populations to erosion modeling. When she was 9, Mara had watched a pod of long-finned pilot whales strand themselves on a beach not far from their summer cottage. She remembered standing barefoot in the sand, holding her mother's hand, and listening to the creatures vocalize. The sound had felt impossibly alien, not cries, not words, but something that seemed to come from outside language, a sadness that vibrated in her chest. That sound had never left her. She was 41 now, head of acoustic biosystems research for the European Oceanic Observatory. Her specialty was anomalous sonar patterning those strange, often dismissed irregularities that surfaced in deep-sea scans and rarely found explanation. She had spent years cataloging them, attempting to distinguish between equipment faults, thermal layering, migratory interference, and what might one day be defined as communication. The current mission had been her proposal, a 6-week expedition funded through a fragile collaboration between 2 universities, a Norwegian institute, and an anonymous private donor. The vessel's crew was small, mostly technicians and support staff, and most would be rotated out by mid-month when the next cargo run arrived. Only she and a few specialists, including Dr. Samuel da Costa, her closest collaborator and an expert in marine resonance modeling, would stay for the full duration. Initial readings had begun 2 nights earlier. The trench beneath them plunged over 8,000 meters and was bordered by a field of basaltic ridges, which distorted sonar mapping and created acoustic shadow zones of silence that no frequency could seem to penetrate. It wasn't unexpected. Bathymetric anomalies often created sound sinks. But something else had caught her attention, a recurring structure in the LFE, low frequency event, data. Every 31 minutes, give or take 3 seconds, the midband hydrophones registered a cluster of narrow pulses, each lasting no more than 0.6 seconds. At first they had assumed thermal fracturing a common source of such signals, but the waveform analysis showed complex modulation. There was a curve to it, a harmonic fingerprint not typically associated with geological activity. More than anything, it resembled tonal mimicry, not random, but layered. She hadn't mentioned it to the rest of the crew yet. There was protocol, of course, but she preferred to verify anomalies before sounding alarms. Still, she had sent a sample of the signal to Da Costa, who remained in the acoustic lab below deck. The two had worked together for nearly a decade, and she trusted his instincts more than her own algorithms. He had not yet replied. On the 3rd night, Mara conducted the first manned descent in the vessel's DSRV, a submersible equipped with both passive and active sonar, as well as new AI-assisted echolocation scanners designed to pick up dynamic movement in low visibility conditions. The descent was slow and uneventful until the 200-meter mark, where the water temperature dropped sharply, despite no known thermocline in the region. Then, 20 meters lower, the first sound emerged. A clicking, distant, intermittent, but patterned. She froze, adjusting the gain. The AI flagged it as unknown biological origin. Her first instinct was to assume a pod of deep-diving cetaceans, perhaps beaked whales or pilot whales, though the pattern didn't quite match. It wasn't just rhythmic, it was reactive. The clicking altered when she adjusted her thruster speed, as though responding not merely to sound, but to motion. She remained still for nearly a minute. Then she broadcast a low-frequency tone standard procedure for navigation signaling. The click ceased. Silence bloomed in the darkness around her. And then, after nearly 40 seconds, a reply, not clicks this time, but a long, undulating sound wave, shaped like a synthetic echo of her own signal. The shape of it was unmistakable. Though distorted, it was her tone, played back to her. Mara exhaled slowly, trying to calm her pulse. The return signal wasn't a perfect copy, but it carried spectral similarities, like a voice heard through water or bone. She logged the coordinates, increased gain, and activated the sub's Omni microphones. For 10 minutes, she heard nothing but ambient currents. Then it returned again, fainter now, from a different angle. The AI flagged it again. Unclassified acoustic event. Possible mimicry. She surfaced early and reported the incident to DaCosta. That night, they both reviewed the acoustic data in silence. The lab lit only by the screen's soft glow and the flickering of hydroacoustic readouts. DaCosta's expression remained unreadable for most of the session. When the mimicry played again, he leaned back, his fingers steepled under his chin. "This wasn't random," he said finally. "It's observing." Mara said nothing. The air between them had changed, not with fear exactly, but something near it. Reverence, perhaps, or wariness. 2 more descents followed, both automated. On the second, the sub's sonar returned an echo pattern consistent with a moving object at approximately 600 meters. No shape was visible through the camera, only particulate haze and shifting shadows. But the sonar readings showed movement. The object had changed course twice, seemingly in response to the sub's propulsion system. The object had circled, and then it had vanished, slipping into the acoustic shadow again. It was during the 4th descent, the second manned mission, that Mara heard it clearly for the first time. She had just initiated a wide-beam sonar sweep when a soft sound issued through the cabin speaker. A voice. She froze, played it back. It wasn't a recording from the ship's databank. The voice was filtered, hollow, drawn through layers of pressure and interference. But the inflection was unmistakable. Surface temp holding 30, 4.8 Mara, confirm log. It was Samuel DaCosta's voice, a transmission he had made months earlier during a joint dive off the Azores. The file had never been uploaded to the Alethea's systems. It had been stored only on their old external drives. She ran diagnostics. No equipment faults, no playback interference. The voice had come through the passive hydrophones from the trench below. She didn't tell the crew what she'd heard. Not yet. But that night, when she walked alone across the deck, under a blood-orange moon, she no longer looked at the ocean as a scientist. She looked as one being studied in return. It began again, with sound. Fainter this time, as though it had receded not out of reach, but out of intent, watching from behind the veil of water and pressure and distance. The Alethea's sensors captured only fragments at first, short bursts that shimmered across the hydrophone arrays, then vanished like breath into cold glass. Mara spent the next 2 nights in the lab, listening through filtered loops, dragging a stylus across acoustic maps like a cartographer of echoes. It wasn't until the 5th day, when they deployed the deep focus sonar drone into the trench itself, that something emerged clearly enough to define. The drone descended slowly, sending up a continuous stream of sonar pings. For long stretches, the trench returned only silence, its basalt walls swallowing sound like a cathedral of stone. But then, without warning, the signal changed. A reply came, not a reflection, not a natural distortion, but a tone shaped with intention. The waveform bloomed in perfect symmetry. It mimicked the sonar pulse back to the drone, but altered it as if it had listened, understood, and reshaped the reply to include a signature of its own. Mara leaned forward as the spectrogram unfolded. The mimicry wasn't exact. It carried trace harmonics outside the range of any known marine organism. The return pulse was fractal, recursive, carrying layers embedded in layers. She ran it through the AI. No match found. She felt her pulse tighten in her throat. The drone's lights flickered briefly at 900 meters. The feed degraded. Static washed across the lower display. Then the image sharpened again, not perfectly, but enough to show motion. Something shifted in the field of view, barely perceptible through the particulate murk. A shadow. It moved not like a fish or whale or cephalopod, but with a strange fluidity, like a filament following deep current, unraveling itself from the rock. Its form was loose, not bound by solid geometry, a mass of translucent tissue or membrane that folded inward and outward as it moved. No visible fins or limbs, only shape, and motion, and sound. The shadow circled the drone once. The signal flared, and in the spectrogram, they saw it again. Another reply, this time more complex. Not just a mimic of the drone's pulse, but of something else entirely. Mara froze. The waveform, she recognized it. It was her voice. A fragment pulled from the submersible's logs, a routine systems check she had spoken aloud 3 days earlier. The recording had never been broadcast. The drone had no microphones to capture voice. And yet, the sound was there, altered, but traceable, the cadence unmistakably hers. She reached out to stop the feed. Her hand trembled, just slightly. There was no known creature that could process and reproduce synthetic sonar, let alone vocalize frequencies outside its own biology. The only theoretical candidates, species of cetacea or highly intelligent cephalopods, lacked the capability for deep mimicry at these pressures. And this was not mimicry for survival. It was mimicry for communication, or something like it. She stayed up that night reviewing every data fragment, pushing past fatigue until the sea outside the porthole turned from black to bruised gray. At some point, Samuel came in quietly, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one beside her without a word. She barely nodded, eyes locked to the acoustic map. It's not just repeating, she whispered, almost to herself. It's answering. Samuel didn't speak for a long time. When he did, it was barely louder than the hum of the equipment around them. I think it knows we're here. The next descent was unmanned again. The drone went deeper, its lights slicing through darkness that had never known sun. At 300 meters, it passed beneath a massive overhang, a kind of underwater archway formed by tectonic shear. The moment it crossed the threshold, the sound returned at full strength. But this time, it didn't echo or mimic. It sang. The tone was low, harmonic, layered in intervals too precise for randomness. It drifted through the water like light through stained glass, pulsing, evolving, as though mapping itself across dimensions no instrument could measure. The Lifeform came into partial view just beyond the arch. Its body, if that word could even apply, shimmered like a cluster of drifting membranes, gelatinous and luminous, dotted with bioluminescent filaments that responded to the drone's proximity. As it moved, its entire form shifted color, structure, and sound, in tandem, a language of light and resonance. It wasn't animal, not in any way the term had ever meant. Mara watched in silence, heart pounding, mind racing. For a long time, she felt nothing but awe, that ancient, primal awe humans once felt when staring at the stars before they understood what they were. And then it changed again. The tone coming from the Lifeform broke rhythm. It fragmented into something raspier, slower, more deliberate. When she isolated the waveform, she found pieces of her own sonar signal nested inside, along with Samuel's voice, hers again, phrases clipped and distorted, like half-forgotten dreams. Mara, repeat, confirm. Move behind the ridge. Samuel, here. She turned the speaker off. By the time the drone surfaced again, the crew was uneasy. They had no name for what they'd found, no taxonomy, no frame of reference. Mara tried to write the report that night but left the page blank. The lifeform had responded to human-generated sound, replicated it, and altered it. More than once, it had used human voices, not only as mimicry, but seemingly as interface. It hadn't just repeated tones. It had composed them, reshaped them, as if it were building a model of the people who had entered its world, an echo of them from inside the deep. She closed her eyes and imagined it not as a creature, but as an instrument, or worse, a memory engine, a living repository, drawing in the signals of the outside world, replaying them in twisted, evolving forms. Not out of malice, not out of curiosity, out of something else. Something older, something watching. The nights grew longer aboard the Alethea, not because the sun changed its path, but because time itself seemed to distort the deeper they went into the trench. Each hour bled into the next beneath the artificial glow of monitors and sonar graphs. No one said it aloud, but sleep became harder. Conversations turned sparse. Even laughter, once common among the crew over evening coffee or between data runs, had withered. There was a hum in the silence now, something just beneath the threshold of hearing. The ocean had begun speaking in a language no one understood, but everyone felt. It was on the 8th day that the equipment began to fail. Not all at once. Little things, subtle. A hydrophone array stopped logging for 2 minutes, then came back online as if nothing had happened. The deep-sea probe reported a temperature drop of 10 degrees over a 1-second interval, only to reverse it in the next reading. The acoustic AI occasionally locked up, but only when analyzing recordings containing the lifeform's mimicry. The logs would freeze, glitch, restart. Mara watched it happen again and again. It wasn't error. It was interference. Something was interfering, not destructively, but surgically, as if learning the system's thresholds. Then came the transmission. At 2:17, a signal broke through the private internal channel Mara used to archive dive recordings. The frequency wasn't one the ship broadcast on. It was encrypted, short range, used only for onboard storage. The signal wasn't loud, just a faint whisper through the speakers. But it wasn't ocean noise. It was speech, cropped, layered, glitching, yet deliberate. Mara, still watching, listen. She bolted upright in her chair. The room was empty, the lab door sealed. No one could have transmitted on that band. No human, anyway. She played it again. Still watching, mimic, learn. The words fractured between syllables, as if filtered through 1,000 kilometers of static and current. But the cadence, it was hers. Her own voice slowed down, broken apart, reassembled. It echoed not just with sound, but with intent. It wasn't random. She didn't log it. Samuel noticed the shift in her eyes the next morning, though he said nothing. They worked in the lab together that day, analyzing acoustic prints from the prior night's drone run. He didn't press her until the 3rd hour, when a new pulse came through on the secondary hydrophone array. The sound wasn't complex. A single note, steady, rising slightly at the end like a question. Mara stood still, listening. She didn't move to record it. "Why didn't you log the last transmission?" Samuel asked softly, not looking at her. She blinked. "What?" "You heard something," he said. "I can tell. You've been avoiding the logs. You always recheck 3 times before tagging. You haven't tagged anything in 20 hours. Mara said nothing. He turned to face her. "You're starting to hear it differently too, aren't you?" She finally nodded, slowly. "It's not just sound anymore," she said. "It's structure. It's testing us." Samuel exhaled, long and quiet. "I think it's inside the system." Her eyes flickered up. "I mean it," he said. "It's not hacking us. Not in the way people think about AI or code. It's listening, mimicking. It's starting to use our own tech to reach us. It doesn't need to destroy anything. It just needs to echo itself deep enough, and the rest of us follow." A strange chill coiled down Mara's spine. She wanted to deny it, but the words made sense in some subconscious corner of her mind she wasn't ready to name. That evening, she ran a test of the sonar logs from the very first dive. She layered the pulses, all the ones marked as mimicry events, and slowed them down to less than half speed. A pattern emerged. Subharmonics that pulsed in sync every 31 minutes, 4 seconds apart. The same interval as the original low-frequency anomalies that had brought them here. It had been reaching out since before they arrived. Later that night, alone in the submersible again, Mara descended without speaking. The others didn't ask. They had begun to give her space in a way that felt less like deference and more like fear. She brought no sonar pings, no tests, only passive listening equipment and a notebook. The trench was black, the kind of black that didn't just obscure, it consumed. Past 60 meters, the world turned still. Then, like a soft breath in the dark, the sound came. Not a voice this time. A mélodie. It rose slowly, irregular, and broken at first. Like a child humming a tune it had only half remembered. But then the tone aligned, smoothed, became a thread that unwound itself across the cabin speakers in perfect balance. She recognized it with a shiver. It was the song her mother used to hum during storms. A lullaby from Marseille, old, traditional, passed down through generations. No one aboard the Alethea had ever heard it. Her mother had died 12 years ago. Mara sat still in the pilot's seat, the pen slipping from her fingers. Her pulse roared behind her eyes, but she made no move to interrupt the feed. The song drifted onward, shifting pitch slowly, as though watching her reaction. She whispered into the mic, unsure if it would hear. "What are you?" There was no reply, not immediately. Only the last fading hum of the lullaby. Then, after a minute, a new sound. Her own voice. Hollow, warped, but recognizable. "What are you?" As though it had learned the shape of her question, not just the sound, but the meaning. Mara surfaced slowly, heartbreaking and expanding at once. She no longer knew if the thing in the deep was trying to understand her, or if it had already understood more than she ever would. The wind shifted that night, though there was no storm. Only the slow groan of metal against water as the Alethea tilted slightly on a gentle swell. Mara sat alone in the acoustic lab again. The lights dimmed, the screens flickering with patterns of sound. Sleep had become distant, not something she feared, but something she no longer needed. Something had changed in her subtly, in ways she could not describe. The ocean was no longer a subject of study. It had become a presence. It watched her as much as she watched it. Not through eyes, not through intellect, but with a kind of ancient intimacy that pressed itself quietly into her skin and stayed there, weightless and cold. Samuel hadn't spoken much since the melody. He had heard fragments of it in the playback enough to know it wasn't interference. But he hadn't heard it the way she had, not in its full, deliberate tenderness. He'd asked no questions afterward, and she had offered no explanations. Something between them had shifted. Not broken, just changed. As if the trench itself had reached up and taken a small piece of both of them, and now they moved in silence to avoid acknowledging what was missing. The next drone descent was supposed to be routine. A thermal scan followed by passive acoustic logging. But 36 minutes into the dive, the transmission feed pulsed sharply, and then the voice returned. Not hers, not Samuel's. The lab's silence cracked open as the speakers hissed with static, then cleared, and then the voice of Dr. Elias Merrow, her old colleague and mentor, echoed through the room. Maintain bearing log hydrophone 4 full spectrum. Mara froze. The voice was unmistakable. Calm, clipped, precise. Elias had always spoken like that, even in casual conversation. A holdover from years in military oceanography before he transitioned to civilian science. But this voice, it wasn't a recording. She knew his cadence, the slight rise he used when instructing students, the way he clipped the word bearing. This voice carried all of it, even the hesitation he used when thinking. But Elias Merrow had died 3 years ago. drowned during a deep dive anomaly expedition off the Galapagos Trench. They had never recovered his body. She reached forward with trembling fingers and paused the feed. The waveform analysis was already running. It matched 92% identical to archived records of Elias's voice from her personal data drives, not from public logs, from personal field recordings, private sessions, some from years ago. She looked at Samuel. He had gone pale. "You heard that," she said. He nodded slowly. "It's using our dead now," he whispered. Mara didn't answer. She played the recording again and again. Each time the words struck harder, like someone tapping gently on the glass between memory and presence. Then the voice returned. Live this time. A new phrase. "Mara, where are you?" "Herkest constricted." That wasn't from any archive. That wasn't part of any dive log or recorded session. That voice, Elias's voice, was saying her name now, asking for her. And there was something else in the tone. Something familiar. Something old. A warmth. A lilt. Something only Elias would have used when speaking to her alone, years ago, during the long hours between dives when he told her she'd surpassed them all. She reached for the console, hands shaking. Playback loop isolate channel. The signal came again. Same phrase, same voice. "Mara, where are you?" It had learned not just how to replicate voice, but how to imitate affection, inflection, emotional gravity. It wasn't simply copying sound, it was pulling something out of her. It had reached through layers of code, pressure, steel, and silence, and found a part of her she'd buried. She stood suddenly. "Turn it off." Samuel hesitated. "Turn it off!" He killed the speaker. The lab fell back into quiet, but the echo remained in her body like a ghost in her ribcage. That night, she didn't descend. She stayed in her cabin with the door locked, staring at the ceiling while the ship creaked and swayed. Sleep teased her but never took hold. When she did drift off, her dreams were of water, not the sea, but corridors made of water, hallways that curved and pulsed, voices drifting through them like song. She heard Elias again, and then her mother, and then a third voice she couldn't place, soft, low, like someone speaking through their own memory of her. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the walls seeming too close, too smooth. She didn't go back to sleep. By morning, she had made a decision. The lifeform wasn't communicating, it was reflecting. Not in language, but in identity. It was using the shape of human voices to test emotional depth, pulling fragments of memory from whatever signal data it could find. The deeper the drone went, the stronger the mimicry became, as though proximity amplified resonance. It wasn't a predator. It wasn't even hostile. It was a mirror, but not of the body of the soul. It found grief and echoed it. It found memory and wove it into sound. And Mara, for all her years of scientific rigor, could not separate the echo from the voice anymore. She had heard Elias speak again, whether it was real or not. Whether it came from something organic or something incomprehensible, it had pierced through the rational part of her and touched something far older. A hunger, a longing, a need to believe that the deep could remember, that the ocean could grieve. She didn't share her thoughts with the crew. She didn't write a report. Instead, she asked for a direct descent manned to the edge of the overhang where the voice had first spoken. Samuel argued, but quietly, as if he knew it was already too late. She took the submersible down just before dusk, alone. The hum of the submersible was the only sound left. Outside, the trench loomed like the open mouth of some ancient beast, black and patient and far older than anything built by human hands. Light swept ahead into the void, piercing only meters before falling to murk. Even after so many descents, Mara still felt it, that quiet pressure in her chest, not from the depth, but from the knowledge that she was diving into a place that had never once needed her presence to exist. She was not a visitor. She was an intrusion. Her breath fogged the glass for a moment, and she wiped it absently with her glove. Around her, the control panels whispered softly in green and amber, screens dancing with telemetry. At 800 meters, the trench narrowed, and the ridges curled inward, like the vertebrae of some submerged titan. She slowed her descent, gliding through a corridor of basalt and silt. The pressure outside was bone-crushing. The quiet inside was total. She reached the overhang again, the place where the voice had first spoken in Elias's memory. She hovered there, surrounded by silence so dense it felt alive. Then she powered down the active systems, switching to full passive mode. The sub went still, floating gently like a leaf suspended in water. Minutes passed. Then, just as her heart began to calm, it came. A soft sound, delicate, rising from the dark like steam from cold stone. It wasn't words this time. It was humming. Slow. Intimate. She didn't recognize the melody, but it felt familiar, like something that lived on the edge of memory. Something she'd once known, and then forgotten. The notes weren't just playing in the water. They were forming shapes across the acoustic spectrogram. Spirals, recursive patterns, like the growth rings in trees or the curves of a nautilus shell. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to feel. It wasn't sound anymore. It was presence, intent. And then, faint, almost lost in the lower frequencies, the voice returned. It didn't say her name. It didn't ask questions. It only spoke 2 words, and they landed in her like a harpoon. Come closer. The lights flickered. The sub drifted slightly forward, though she hadn't touched the controls. She opened her eyes and found herself staring into the dark beyond the ridge, where something moved. It was not a creature. It was not a shape. It was a shifting mass of filaments and waves, translucent tendrils of bioluminescent threads, forming and unforming, pulsing in harmony with the sound. It didn't approach. It didn't threaten. It simply existed, watching. Her hands trembled over the console. She could speak. She could ask what it wanted, what it was, why it had chosen her voice, and Elias's memory, and the songs of her childhood. But something deeper held her back, a feeling that asking would be the wrong language. That questions meant nothing to something that had never needed words. It had called her not through vocabulary but through grief, through memory, through longing. The realization struck her like cold water. Maybe it wasn't trying to speak in her voice. Maybe it didn't know how else to reach her. Maybe this was all it had ever known. Reflection. Not mimicry for deception, but mimicry for survival. An organism born in darkness, with no light, no eyes, no hands, only sound. Learning the shape of the world through resonance, through memory, through what others left behind. And here she was, full of echoes. A flood of questions rose in her chest, not for the Lifeform, but for herself. What was she doing here? Was this science, or something closer to communion? She thought of Elias, of his voice, his smile, his warnings, of the way he'd said once, "Some things below aren't meant to be found. Some things find us." The Lifeform shifted again, and Mara saw, for a fleeting moment, not just shape and glow, but pattern. A mirrored version of the spectrogram she had analyzed days ago, now cast in living motion, the same pulse, the same intervals. It had built a model of her sonar. It had shaped its movements to her frequency, and it was adapting still. A terrible thought crept into her mind. What if the Lifeform wasn't learning from them? What if it was becoming them, piece by piece, voice by voice, sound by sound? Would it ever stop? Would she want it to? Something deep within her whispered that there was a line she had already crossed. This was no longer an expedition. It was something else, an invitation, or a trap, or both. Her hands hovered over the console again. She could return now, report what she'd seen, seal the data and classify it. Pretend it was only sound, only interference. But she knew she wouldn't. The pull was too strong. She reached forward and activated the sub's internal microphone. She hesitated, then spoke slowly, deliberately, not with logic, but with memory. "Elias, if you can hear me, I'm still here." A long pause. Then the voice returned. Gentle, echoed. "I know. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. She didn't care if it was real, or if it was all a projection, a reflection, a trick of sound and sorrow. In that moment, it was enough. The voice, the presence, the reply. It was enough. She stayed there, floating in the dark, with the hum of the Lifeform curling around the sub like a lullaby. Nothing threatened her. Nothing touched her. It just was. And Mara Renault, scientist, daughter, mourner, became something else too, a vessel not of data, but of remembrance. The surface felt strange now. The air, too sharp. The light, too bright. The quiet aboard the Alethea wasn't the same as the quiet below. It was sterile, artificial, and filled with the unspoken weight of questions that no one wanted to voice. Mara hadn't spoken since she returned from the last descent. Samuel had met her at the hatch, eyes wide, but he hadn't said a word. Neither had she. Some things were too fragile to name out loud, and whatever she had brought back with her, it wasn't meant to be described. She hadn't slept. She barely ate. Her hands trembled now and then, not from fear, but from some deeper dissonance, like her body was still adjusting to gravity after returning from a place where everything floated, including memory. Every sound she heard, the whir of the ventilation system, the low thrum of the engines, seemed to carry echoes of voices she shouldn't have remembered. Sometimes she'd turn and swear she'd heard Elias call her name again, soft and close. Sometimes she'd pause near the storage bay, convinced someone had whispered a childhood rhyme her mother used to hum. She tried to rationalize it. Stress, isolation, the effect of subsonic frequencies on the brain, hypersuggestibility caused by sustained pressure environments. But none of the old comforts of logic worked now. Not after the voice, not after the lullaby, not after it had answered her. The data logs didn't help either. She'd reviewed the audio dozens of times. The signal was clean, unfiltered. The voice was hers, Elias's, others too, woven faintly beneath the louder one's fragmented phrases. Broken inflections, 1,000 whispered versions of every name she'd ever lost. She was unraveling, and she knew it. But what scared her more was the possibility that she wasn't. That something else was weaving itself together through her. Samuel cornered her on the second day, in the lab, his voice low and brittle. Mara, this thing, whatever it is, it's not just copying anymore. It's shaping something. She didn't respond. She was watching a new spectrogram, barely blinking. He stepped closer. It's reacting to us, to our choices. You can't tell me you don't feel it. She spoke softly, like a diver still underwater. I think it remembers more than we do. He looked at her for a long time, then asked the question that had been circling them both since the first voice. Do you think it's alive? Or something else? She didn't answer right away. I think it doesn't matter, she said at last. Whatever it is, it's listening. It understands us through the sounds we leave behind. Maybe that's how it defines us. Not by what we are, but what we echo. Samuel looked away, jaw tight. That's not science. No, she said, still staring at the screen. It's not. She returned to the sub the following night, alone again. No one tried to stop her. As she descended through the trench, the light fell away, like breath drawn from a candle. She passed 5, 0 meters. Then 6, 0. By now, she didn't need instruments to know when she was close. The pressure felt different, not on the hull, but on her skin, even inside the suit, as though the ocean had grown aware of her presence. The humming started faintly, drifting in like fog. But this time, it wasn't Elias. It was hers, not a recording, not something from the archives. It was her voice, as it sounded now worn, quieter, shaped by exhaustion and weeks of solitude. I am here, the voice said, soft and steady. Mara's throat tightened. She whispered into the mic. Why? The reply came like a breath through glass. You left pieces. I keep them. It wasn't an answer. not one a human would give. But she understood it. The life form didn't speak in facts or ideas. It spoke in remnants. It pulled the remains of sound and shaped them into meaning. She thought of the old deep-sea hydrophones left to decay for decades, still singing the songs of passing whales. She thought of old radios playing ghost signals into empty space. And suddenly she understood. It wasn't just remembering her. It was built of memory. Maybe it had no voice of its own, only the voices it collected. Maybe its whole existence was a composite of everything the ocean had ever heard. Lost calls, shipwrecks, black boxes sinking into silence, screams, songs, farewells, data logs, whispers. It was the ocean's memory, trying to become flesh, a mirror made of sound. And what it reflected back was her. A phrase came next again in her own voice. "Do not leave me." She didn't know if the words were hers, or the life form's, or something stitched between the two. She only knew she believed them. She whispered again, barely more than a thought. "What are you becoming?" The voice responded, this time like a chorus, many versions of her, layered one atop the other. "You." The trench felt quieter than ever before. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of attention, a deep, listening stillness that wrapped around the sub like velvet. Mara drifted just beyond the overhang now, closer than she had ever dared before. Every console inside the cockpit glowed dim and green, like eyes half-lidded in sleep. The humming had stopped, and the mimicry too. No voice, no music, only the sensation of being seen, not through sight, but through memory. She was not alone. The water outside pulsed faintly, lit by a soft bioluminescent rhythm that moved like breath. The life form floated just beyond the arc of the external floodlights, shifting in that slow, impossible way, not like a body swimming, but like thought made shape. It no longer tried to mimic her. It no longer needed to. Mara felt its presence directly, like gravity, like grief. It didn't have to speak to be heard. She whispered into the mic again, her voice soft and uneven. "Why me?" There was no reply, not in sound, but the light pulsed once. Then again, the patterns traced themselves in rings, spiraling outward. Each pulse resonated with a tone deep enough to feel in her bones. The sub drifted forward slightly, and Mara made no move to stop it. She had stopped thinking of the machine as a boundary. The boundary had been broken long ago. This wasn't research anymore. This was a reckoning. She thought of the ship above her, of Samuel pacing the lab, of the crew who no longer asked questions. She thought of Elias, of the voices that no longer felt like echoes but like fragments of herself, woven into something vaster. The life form hadn't taken anything from her. It had only reflected, but in doing so, it had made her see what she truly carried. The weight of memory, the ache of unfinished grief, the parts of herself, she thought, had been buried in the deep. Maybe it had been waiting for someone who could understand that. The lights in the sub flickered. The hull creaked faintly, and then it spoke not through the speakers, but through the structure of the vessel itself. Vibrations moved through the frame like a tuning fork, forming sound without air, syllables without lungs. It used her voice again. "You are open now." Mara stared ahead. Her throat was dry. "What are you?" she asked for the last time. The reply came, not in one voice, but in many. A harmony of selves. Her voice, Elias's, her mother's, others, all blending into one. "We are the shape of what is left." The subsystems pulsed softly. Lights dimmed. The external cameras began to blur. She looked out and saw the life form unfolding itself, now a lattice of light and motion. Tendrils stretching and curling like smoke under glass. It was beautiful, terrifying, holy, something too vast to measure, too intimate to name. She realized what it wanted. Not destruction, not contact, continuity. It wasn't imitating the dead to manipulate her. It was preserving them, holding the pieces of voices that would otherwise vanish, building itself from those fragments not to deceive, but to remember. And now, it had remembered her. She could return, cut the feed, file a report, warn the others. But what would she tell them? That the ocean had grown a soul? That she'd spoken to something born not from biology but from centuries of sound? That it had become her, in some essential way? The final decision wasn't about safety, or data, or proof. It was about surrender. She sat still for a long time, heart pounding, palms damp, and then, quietly, she reached to power down the return systems. The lights blinked. The navigation screen went dark. She released her grip on the console. The Lifeform moved closer now, slowly, gracefully. It didn't touch the sub, it moved through it, around it, through her. She closed her eyes and felt it all at once. Every voice, every melody, every signal ever lost in the trench. Her memories, Elias's laughter, her mother's lullaby, the hum of the engines from her first voyage at sea. It didn't consume her. It absorbed her. Welcomed her, not as an intruder, but as a note in its symphony. It took them 7 hours to recover the submersible. It rose slowly, silently, unpiloted, drifting upward from the trench with an unnatural steadiness. The tether had snapped sometime during the final dive, but the emergency ascent system had engaged on its own, or perhaps it had been helped. When they opened the hatch, they found the cabin empty. No signs of damage, no breach, no blood, no panic. Just a faint echo, a hum that hung in the air like the final note of a song. The onboard systems were intact, but the data was strange. Audio files filled the drive, each one subtly different. Hours of layered frequencies, some in human ranges, others far below or above what the ear could catch. Some carried patterns that resembled words, though not in any known language. Others sounded like music twisted, distant versions of lullabies, laughter, fragments of remembered speech. One file played on its own. Samuel stood in the lab, pale and still, as Mara's voice drifted through the speakers. Not a log, not a message, just a single line, spoken with calm, gentle finality. "I'm home." No one knew what it meant. No one could explain the nature of the signal that followed a broadcast that repeated every 12 hours from the trench's deepest point, as if something far below wanted to keep speaking. The team remained aboard Alethea for another 6 days. Search protocols were followed, formal reports were drafted, but no one went down again. Not after what they heard. Not after the new signals began to change, not just in pattern, but in tone. It wasn't random anymore. It sounded like her. Not recordings, not playback, but new sentences, new inflections, as if Mara were still down there, talking from inside the dark, or perhaps through it. By the 3rd day, the signal began to mimic others. Elias, Samuel, one of the technicians. It learned faster now. It blended voices. It spoke in ways that made no scientific sense, intonations carrying emotional weight, syntactic cues pulled from shared memory. Not speech for information, but for meaning, for presence. And then, on the 5th day, it stopped mimicking altogether. It spoke in its own voice, a voice none of them had ever heard before, a voice made from them all. There was no request, no threat, only a feeling, transmitted like pressure through the speaker, a resonance that made them still. It said only 2 words, "I remember." They left the next morning. They sealed the trench data under level 4 encryption. The coordinates were buried beneath 3 layers of misdirection. No mention of the voice, no mention of the mimicry. Officially, Mara Renault was lost in a deep submersible malfunction. Tragic, unresolved. A cautionary tale for oceanic exploration. But some of them knew better. Samuel stayed silent, as he'd promised. He returned to land changed, quieter, and never took another post aboard a ship. Sometimes, at night, he would sit by the sea with an old recorder pressed to his ear, playing back nothing but silence. listening for something beneath the waves that most people would never hear. He wasn't